Welcome to Week 2, Part 1, where we discuss building and breaking patterns. Now that we've established our setup and our propelling event, our story, like this Ferris wheel, is rolling right along. This week, we'll read Everyday Use by Alice Walker, if you haven't yet. We'll create a series of escalating incidents, what we call our escalation, and like a quilt, we'll make a pattern. We'll take a look at the concept of story arc, and we'll see how all the elements we create support our characters' before and after state of mind. We'll also cover characterization and backstory, and these things are very important as you start to write your story. Escalation. Okay, you see from the pattern of the quilt that we've shown that that's actually one of the motifs in Everyday Use, so I'm using that here. In the escalation sequence, things get even more complicated for our primary character. Okay, this is where we start to reinforce the pattern that began with our propelling event. The propelling event can be viewed as actually the first element in the escalation. That's what kicks off the whole escalation sequence, where things get even worse for our characters. In Reunion, for example, after they're kicked out of that first restaurant, remember the first restaurant where they're kicked out there is the propelling event. The behavior of Charlie's father only worsens until they are kicked out of 3 more restaurants. And that's the sequence. Restaurants 2, 3, and 4 are our escalation sequence. This is a very clear pattern. In other stories, the pattern is a little more subtle, but in Reunion, this is why I love to teach this story. It's a great example of how action can truly advance a story and move Charlie even farther and farther from what he wants and closer to what he needs. And it's through that escalation of restaurant sequences that that story accomplishes that. Let's look at escalation in Everyday Use. Okay. Dee announces that she's abandoned her birth name. That's the propelling event. That's number 1 in our pattern of Mama looking at Dee in a different light. Okay, so for the escalation sequence, we're going to talk about the butter churn. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting in Everyday Use. Dee decides just to help herself to the lid of the butter churn. Okay? Then she goes for the dasher of the butter churn. Okay, and if you're like me when you're reading that story, you're probably thinking, what is that girl going to go for next? Is she going to take the front door off the house and decide that needs to be the display in her house? The internal conflict, what's going on here as Dee is helping herself to these things, very important things that the family still cherishes and probably uses, Mama begins to feel even more and more distance from Dee. Her Johnny Carson dream is fading fast. Okay, what happens for number 4? Okay, number 4 in our escalation sequence, what does Dee do? She takes the homemade quilts. She actually goes to the trunk next to Mama's bed and helps herself to 2 of the homemade quilts. Okay, the internal conflict has reached a peak here. For Mama, this is the worst because those quilts were for Maggie. And she reflects to herself at some point that she had offered these quilts to Dee before, but they weren't good enough for her then. So this is where, again, it gets really interesting. This is where I'd like to talk about the idea of the story arc. A story arc, at this point, this is what it looks like. We have the setup. Mama waits for Dee in the front yard. We already looked at how Walker wrote that. We look at the before phase. Mother admires Dee. And so an arc is exactly what it implies. It's a curve of action that is happening. You have the setup. Nothing's really happening there because we're waiting for the action. The propelling event is number 2 in our series of events here, and that's where Dee charges in and she announces, my name is Wangaro. Okay, that's number 1. The escalation continues. All the events in green are where you see the escalation continue. Dee takes the butter churn top, she takes the dasher 2, then she takes the homemade quilts. And that's really important because we see the advance of action here and we see what's happening to Mama behind the scenes, internally, what's going on. So when you start to build your escalation sequence, look at it like this, like a stair step of events. That's what I do. I kind of picture it in my mind of how things are getting worse and worse, and the best way to do that is like a ladder or a stair step or an arc of a little mountain, which is what this story arc looks like here. So before we talk about escalation, again, I want to stop for a minute. I want to talk a little bit about, let's see, oh, yes, how to create a powerful escalation. We'll talk about characterization in a minute, but I want to give some hints before we do that because characterization is tied to that. How to create a powerful escalation like this stair step here. Avoid bringing in any more important characters, objects, or places of great significance. You've set some things in place by now. By the time you get to your escalation, you're definitely at the middle of your story. You want to return to your treasure chest for inspiration and build off something here, an image, an emotion, anything tied to what your character wants. This is a great place to get ideas for your escalation because remember, it's your character's internal motivation that's going to do that. The escalation wouldn't be near as effective if we didn't know that Mama's internal conflict is her relationship with her daughter Dee. So, for what Mama wants, she wants to admire Dee. She wants the two of them to be closer. We're going to create an escalation that's going to drive that further and further away from what Mama wants and closer to what Mama needs. So for your escalation, you can add backstory. You can invent a catastrophe. You can find other reasons for your character to be further and further away from what they want. You can start a fight between your character and another character. This is very powerful. You can reveal a secret. In the case of Reunion, we don't exactly get in a fight, but you can certainly sense, even though Cheever doesn't tell us exactly what Charlie's thinking. Charlie doesn't tell us either what he's thinking, more importantly, but you can see that Charlie's getting a little, he would not be human if he weren't getting a little bit annoyed with what's going on with all the restaurants, because all he wants to do is have a meaningful conversation with his dad, build a meaningful relationship, and this just is not happening. His father's boorish behavior is dominating everything and ruining it. So for your powerful escalation, and remember those restaurants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, and 4 are the escalation. For everyday use, the escalation is the butter churn, the top, the dasher, and then trying to take those quilts. That's your escalation. You can do anything you want as long as you're moving your character farther and farther from what they want. Now, let's talk about characterization. At some point in your story, and certainly by the middle of the story, which is where we are now, you want to have some physical details, okay? Especially for your primary character. So if you haven't started to build those yet for your story, you'll want to put them in your treasure chest, little details that you come across, and that would be their body, their face, their height, their weight. But don't stop there. Go to talk about the style of moving. When Mama couldn't get off the couch, that was one thing that told us a little bit what Mama's like. The way of speaking, okay, the way Maggie spoke when Maggie was having a reaction to what was going on. Mama says to us, "I hear Maggie sucking her breath." Oh, is what it sounds like. Like when you see the wriggling end of a snake just in front of your foot on the road. This is Mama's voice here. Mama's using an experiment, and she's using experience from her own day-to-day life. They probably are located where they're going to see some snakes on the road, and she's bringing that up. And we don't have to have a huge imagination to know probably who the snake is in this story. And Maggie is reacting to what, metaphorically, she probably sees as a snake in the house, and that might be Dee. There's no need to overdo it. Of course, a few details go a long way, and this is very important. We don't describe every single hair on Mama's head. We don't describe every single article of clothing on Maggie. We describe her awkwardness, how she is hanging back like a dog. That's one of the things that Walker does that is extremely effective. So those are some things that you can do with great effect in your story, and now's the time to do that. Cheever doesn't give us a lot of details. Cheever describes more of what the father's energy is like and in his actions, and that's an important characterization. He doesn't describe Charlie very much. Charlie doesn't describe himself, but we know that Charlie's a young man, that he's meeting his father on their vacation. So that's one thing that tells us that he's not in school right now, but he will be. Another way that we can characterize our characters is to go into backstory a little bit and look at this incredible character right here. This is a character that definitely has a story or two, and I like this picture because this tells us a lot. We kind of know where he's been. We kind of know where this character is going. One of the ways that authors do this is they reflect on the past. You know, they don't have a lot of room, especially in a 3,000 word story, to tell us the whole history of a character. So they do that through a few very telling sentences. And through backstory, you can reflect on a character's psychological history, right? Information that tells us what their personality's like. You can reflect on childhood trauma. This is very, very effective. Tessa Hadley does that a lot in her story, Flight. She reflects on the difficulties in she and Susan's history as sisters throughout time. She does that a lot. She does it when in between the action, she reflects back. And this is very similar to what we do. You know, we do this all the time. You may be at Walmart at the grocery store, but you're thinking about things that happened when you were young, probably. You can't help it. This is just the beauty of the mind and how it works. Backstory is also a very, very effective way to talk about occupations. You know, we could look at this character here, this picture, as fitting in with a story called Queen Elizabeth by Brad Felver. He was as wiry as a cornstalk, and always would be. That night he spoke of how he wanted to make desk. Desk, he said, smiling as if he knew how absurd it sounded, for now he had his union card and worked what jobs came his way. Well, you get the sense from that very last sentence what kind of jobs he was used to having, what kind of jobs he would have. And that's a very effective way in a very few sentence sequence here, how the writer was able to put a whole bunch of stuff in there. And again, when you're writing a 3,000 word story, you can't go into a lot of detail. In your treasure chest, you can get as long as you want and put as much as you want to, but you've got to compress that. That's really a short story, is the art of compression. You've got to compress that for a cogent short story. Backstory, and what I love about this, and this is why this is related to the escalation sequence, is Claire tells us what happened between she and Susan. She starts to do this right at the escalation. As soon as Susan is on the scene and is getting ready to reject her, she says, what had happened was this. When Susan's husband left, she had moved back with her 4 children into this house, which their parents owned. Their father had worked all his life on the railway and had saved enough out of his wages to put down a deposit and then pay off a mortgage over the years. So she tells us a little more, but this is the point of contention between them. Who lives in the house, who feels entitled to it, and who feels that she should be paid back because she's not living in the house. So this is a lot of detail that she's saved for us till the escalation sequence, and that helps advance the action in the story, and it also helps paint a great characterization of what the characters are like. So I encourage you to do this. Flood your backstory in where it makes sense. You'll want to create compressions, 3 or 4 sentences that tell us a lot. You can get your details at any point from your treasure chest because you've been storing those things there, and it can really work well for your characters and your story. So for week 2, part 1, as a reminder, we'll want you to read Everyday Use. We want you to picture your story arc. What will it look like? Write your escalation sequence. Begin making notes for that so that you can begin. This week we're going to write section 2 of our short story, another 1,000 words. So you want to have those there. You want to have characterization. You want to have backstory ideas and other details that you want to add to your treasure chest. These will be important for you as you build your story. I want you to also go through the lessons in week 2, part 1. We have a number of short lessons with some hints and pointers and tips that will help you as you do that. So try to go through the part 1 elements of week 2. And your inspiration as you do that is, this is what I love about this quote, the great thing about a short story, says Emma Donoghue, is that it doesn't have to trawl through someone's whole life. It can come glancingly from the side. And that's the point about a short story. You don't have a lot of extra room. You can't tell someone's whole story. You have to pick cogent, concrete, specific details that do that for your reader. You have to do it in a way that intrigues your reader, that doesn't try to tell their whole story, but lists enough so that your reader is interested in your story. And in that way, you hold suspense and you really hook your reader and captivate them. You continue to do that when you build patterns. The next part of week 2, part 2, we're going to talk about how we actually break that pattern that we set up. So I look forward to seeing you back here